Oh, it's been a long old time since we broke down specific vitamins and nutrients. And, well, I guess we're going to go a little bit higher than that because this is, well, at its base root, okay? If we were to break down what exactly is table salt, enriched salt, Himalayan salt, Celtic salt, there's a whole bunch of different salts that are out there. No, we're not going to analyze sodium and chlorine together to make a salt molecule. We're just going to take a look at salt and why it's actually a good thing, because you hear a lot from just common parlance that salt is so bad for you. There's so much salt in everybody's diets that you just need to get off of it. While that is true, most people's sodium intake is through the roof. Salt, in and of itself, is essential. You need sodium in order to perform appropriately. So, let's enlighten the folks, shall we? Everyone likes to talk about the good old days in many food circles and hark back to ancestral diets that were more natural and more nutritious. Yeah, of course, just like Tridecons won a time machine back when men were men and women were women. A lot of people will pine for the days, justifiably so, when the food that you ate looked like the food that you picked and created. Meat looked like a steak. Not like a Slim Jim. However, in one respect, modern people enjoy a huge advantage over their ancestor. Everybody in the world today has access to plentiful, inexpensive salt. Yes, indeed. It's not that basic white and blue, I forget the company who even makes it, but you guys all know that table salt that's out there that's iodinized table salt from a little salt shaker, kind of garbage stuff, especially when you have high quality salts out there. An interesting article in the Social History of Salt, published in the 1963 Scientific American issue. Oh, back when the Scientific American actually did science. Interesting. Notes that in ancient times, where salt was plentiful, the society tended to be free, independent, and democratic. 2 out of the 3 ain't bad. Where it was scarce, and those who controlled the salt controlled the people. Oh, it's kind of like a weird bastardization of a Mad Max apocalypse. Those who controlled the water controlled the population. Well, those who controlled the salt controlled the population. Interesting. For example, along the shores of the Mediterranean and the North Sea, farmers and fishermen with access to plentiful salt enjoyed free societies. By contrast, areas in the world that had to import most of their salt or obtain it from small, isolated sources show that more autocratic pattern. In history of frequent conflict, monopoly, and all-powerful rulers in the ancient river valley civilizations of the Nile, Babylon, India, China, Mexico, and Peru, the kings and priests maintained their rule and obtained their income through the monopoly of salt, of which the population depended on their survival. Well, that's nice. Let's just get to some facts of salt, because we got the history of salt. Pharaohs and kings used to control salt, and that was bad, but now you can get it off of any street vendor, and probably your general diet is going to have an excess of salt. So, the fact is, we cannot live without salt. Salt is our main source of sodium and chloride, both essential minerals. While small amounts of sodium and chloride are present in a variety of foods, chloride, very small trace amounts in leafy greens, and sodium, shellfish, maybe a little bit. The main source of these 2 essential minerals is salt. So, it'll help with blood pressure. One of the major functions to help regulate blood volume and pressure, including the flexibility of blood vessels. It's almost like that's the contrary of everything that you've been taught. For certain individuals who are salt sensitive, excessive consumption of sodium can increase blood pressure, but for the majority, blood pressure is not raised by increased salt intake. I'll run that back one more time, just for everybody in the back. Blood pressure is not raised by the increase of the majority of people out there. In most people, even a drastic increase in salt consumption does not raise blood pressure. There you go. When our salt consumption is too low, defense mechanisms kick in. These include salt hunger to increase sodium intake and a reduction of urine and sweat to reduce sodium loss. When salt intake is too high, salt receptors in the tongue make the salt taste unpleasant, which tends to decrease the intake of salty foods. Interesting. digestion. Salt plays a key role in digestion. Sodium-dependent enzymes are required for carbohydrate digestion to break down complex carbohydrates and sugars into monosaccharides such as glucose, fructose, and galactose. Sodium is also involved in transporting these monosaccharides across the intestinal wall. Chloride in salt is a major component of hydrochloric acid needed for protein digestion. Hydrochloric acid also plays a role in keeping parasites and pathogens from entering the digestive tract. Parasites can easily gain a foothold in those on low salt diets. Other symptoms of hypochloremia, low hyperchloric acid, includes bloating, acne, iron deficiency, belching, indigestion, diarrhea, upset stomach, and whatever the rest, Pepto-Bismol will help cure you with. But anyways, and multiple food allergies. In addition to carbohydrate and protein digestion, fat digestion also requires salt. Sodium is involved in the manufacture of bile, which emulsifies fat so that it can be absorbed. Pretty important, given the fact that it helps with digestion of all three macronutrient quadrants. Neurological function. We need salt for our brains. Hey, you stupid! Make sure you have some salt. Chloride is essential for the growth of the brain and the development of neurological function, and sodium activates enzymes needed for development and function of glial cells in the brain. Unfortunately, so many so-called experts advise pregnant and nursing mothers to adapt a low-salt diet, and we call those people stupid because they're also running a huge salt deficit. Adrenal function. Adrenal glands are responsible for the release and the regulation of more than 30 of the body's hormones, including sex hormones and hormones that regulate blood pressure, glucose levels, mineral metabolism, healing, and stress result. When levels of aldosterone drop, one of the primary hormones in the body, which often happens during periods of stress or fatigue, the body responds by craving salt to help stabilize blood pressure. Adrenal glands are working hard to produce aldosterone in situations of salt depredation. They may not be able to produce other important hormones, including stress and sex hormones. Medical literature has repeatedly linked low-salt diets with conditions like insulin resistance, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, increased cardiovascular mortality, and readmission cognition loss in babies and older adults, and unsteadiness, falls, and fractures. So, how much salt do you need? Chances are you're probably getting well more than enough, but, let's get some guidelines established, shall we? Americans consume an average of 1.5 teaspoons of salt per day, which intensifies the requirement of sodium and chloride for most people. However, many need more salt to thrive on twice that amount. Surprisingly, available data suggests that Western societies consume between 3 and 3.3, so 3 1/3 teaspoons of salt per day from the early 1800s until the end of World War II, back when people were healthier. Based on military archives for prisoner of war and soldier rations around the world. And I would take their word on that because they were developing the rations to make sure that all of the soldiers on the front line were of functioning capacity. That was well researched, well researched. Of course, much of the salt was for preserving meat and fish and had a much wider role in food preservation at the time. During the War of 1812, despite the high cost, salt rations amounted to 3 teaspoons a day per day. Interesting. American prisoners of war incarcerated in Britain's Dartmouth prisons bitterly complained that a little over 2 teaspoons of salt per day they received were part of scanty and meager diets from men who brought up in the land of liberty and never used to feast on luscious fruits of plenty. After World War II, the advent of refrigeration rather than salt as a means of preserving food, salt consumption in the United States dropped dramatically to about half the rate and has remained flat for the last 50 years. During the same time, rates of hypertension have increased, thus casting doubt to any linkage between salt consumption and blood pressure levels. Interesting. A 2011 study published in the Journal of American Medical Association, researchers found that moderate salt intake to be associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular events, whereas a low intakes equivalent to less than or equal to 1.5 teaspoons, 8 grams, which contains 3.5 grams of sodium of salt per day, were associated with a increased risk of cardiovascular death and hospitalization for congestive heart failure. Higher intakes of more than 3 teaspoons, 7 grams of sodium of salt per day were associated with an increased risk of stroke, heart attack, and other cardiovascular events. Interesting. Despite what we know about the importance of adequate salt in the diet, on June 1st, 2016, U.S. health officials announced a new set of recommendations regarding salt content in processed food. The stated goal was to help Americans reduce sodium intake. Wow, that was during the Barack Obama administration, one of his final parting shots. How adorable. To levels recommended by the Institute of Medicine in 2004 and 5. Right about the same time, they were pushing the health pyramid the hardest. The dietary food pyramid. Food pyramid. That's what it was. 12 servings of grain brought to you by Farmers Association, Grain Farmers Association of America. Interesting. The maximum recommended was set at slightly more than 1 teaspoon. Ironically. About the same time, the United States health officials announced their new initiative to reduce salt intake. The Lancet published a large population-based study that showed the risk of mortality and serious cardiovascular events increases significantly when salt intake drops below 2/3 of a teaspoon in an adult of average weight. The good news is that we're all free to ignore the United States guidelines and enjoy salt on our food. Yeah, buddy. Bad news is that most salt in the food supply is refined, a process that removes all magnesium and trace minerals and adds anti-caking agents. Yeah, that's your low-quality table salt that you normally just get from a restaurant shaker. Much of the sodium ferrocyanide, ammonium citrate, and aluminum silicate. Fortunately, many brands of unrefined salt are now available. Choose a salt that's a light gray. That'd be your Celtic salt. I've heard good things about that. Haven't been able to procure any myself. Pink, Himalayan pink salt. Everybody knows about that at this point in time. Or beige, not bright white. Bright white is refined. And that's one instance where white ain't right. Not really. Indicating the presence of minerals. One last caveat, the government recommendations of reduced salt in processed food. Manufacturers are adding flavor enhancers that mimic the taste of salt. Great. We know that you like the taste of salt and your body prefers it and actually has a built-in mechanism that prevents you from over-consuming salt. So we're just going to go ahead and trick your brain by just adding a chemical. So much better, right? Developed by a biotech company called Cenomics. The product is labeled as artificial flavors. Yeah, that's where you get all of those artificial flavors, or even more nefarious, natural flavors. Nothing natural about natural flavors. I got some old videos on that if you are so interested. They are added to most processed food, including soft drinks and juices, snack food, cereals, cookies, soups, and mixes. The health effects are unknown. We can kind of imagine it's probably not that great. Just artificial flavors that are put in there. Anything that's been overly processed, not great in general. Health effects are unknown, but one consequence is likely increased obesity, as consumers of processed food just eat and eat and eat to satisfy the cravings brought on by the additives and nutrient deficiencies. So guess what? You know how you stem those cravings for salt? Eat some good quality salt. Himalayan pink, gray, Celtic salt if you can find it, and then I don't know what the beige colored salt is, but hey man, shout out to that as well. So with all that said, thank you all very much for the gift of your time. I've been Don Consuelo. I want you to follow your gut and get after it. Take care, everyone.